Thank you for joining this training or guidance session. My name is Letitia Adams, and I'm going to walk you through the Safety Contract Management Pretest Plan and Work Instruction Guidance. The intent of this guidance is simply to aid the contract manager in their roles and responsibilities as far as when the seller or contractor presents information to you. So, overview of what we'll be looking at today. We'll be looking at risk levels. We're going to look at the difference between a work instructions and a pre-task plan. We're going to look at the different sections of the pre-task plans and what should those look like if you are accepting or rejecting those, such as Part 1, which is the job safety analysis, Part 2, which is the planning questions. Part 2, which is the safety Fema, Part 2, planning questions, Part 3, worker engagement, and then we're going to look at some examples of good versus bad pre-task plans and why are they good or bad. Then we're going to look at some overview of the risk mitigations that are found in GM special safety conditions. So just a reminder to everyone, this training here was found on our global SCM website. In addition, any additional information or guidance tools that you will need will also be found on the SCM website. You can simply click on this link and it'll take you there. So, safety contract management. So you're taking this course, it should mean that you have already taken the full course of safety contract management, which is 55030. And in that course, you learned about pre-qualification, preparation, award phase, orientation, oversight, and evaluations. So the whole purpose of this guidance training is to provide a little more insight on this step 5 here, which is oversight. So when we think about oversight, we think about assessing safety performance, including appropriate training and documents and licenses as required by GM through routine day-to-day inspections and periodic audits. We're looking to analyze trends and reinforce expectations as necessary to the seller. This includes verifying job safety analysis, key steps, risk assessment, safety Fema, and worker engagement. So this is our boots on the ground phase. This is where we verify that the worker is actually following the contractual requirements that we added to the SOR or SOW. So, evaluating hazards within a task. Remember, the oversight phase, which is what this entire presentation is focused on, evaluates the hazards within each of the seller's tasks. The whole safety contract management program is focused on risk. It is a risk-based approach. The seller needs to determine the risk level based on the work performed, and there are 3 categories: low risk, medium risk, and high risk. As you can see in the slide here, the word seller is underlined because this is the seller's process, right? The seller or contractor is the one that is evaluating the risk level of their employees. GM is simply looking at it from a standpoint of, are you fulfilling your contractual requirements? So, a description of each of the risk levels are as follows. Low risk is defined as the seller's employees are exposed to hazards that have the potential to cause minor and/or reversible injuries at most. Administrative or engineering controls are in place and properly functioning. For medium risks, we're saying the seller's employees are exposed to hazards that have the potential to cause reversible or life-altering injuries that are mitigated solely by administrative controls or potential for a fatality or major life-altering injuries mitigated by engineering controls. Then we're saying high risk is defined as the seller's employees are exposed to hazards that have the potential to cause a fatality or major life-altering injury and are mitigated solely by administrative controls or potential for life-altering injury with no safety controls in place. And then there is unacceptable risk, where we're saying the seller's employees are exposed to hazards that have the potential to cause major life-altering injuries or fatalities with no safety controls in place. So when you look at the different scopes of work. We have come up with this guidance table to help guide you in. These are predefined scopes of work and their risk level. For instance, if you have a contractor on site performing services in this category, we're saying that these are typically defined as low risk. As you know, this is not an all-inclusive list. These are just some examples. If you want more guidance, we do have the SCM Contract Questionnaire that can also aid you. So for instance, if you have municipal waste pickup, that is considered a low-risk contractor in the work that they do. If you're having someone from vending services, we're saying vending services is low risk, the work that they do on our site. If you have someone from a police department to come on site, or a parts supplier who is viewing non-compliant parts only, the scope of their work is also considered low risk. You can go through this entire list at a later date, but it's here for you to view. Now we're looking at medium risk scopes of work. So these are examples of typical scopes of work that we are saying are predefined as being medium risk. For instance, if you have someone, or I'm sorry, a seller coming on site to perform landscaping maintenance, we're considering that as medium risk. Welding or hot work, scrubber services, delivery companies using a flatbed, hazardous waste collection, parts suppliers sorting non-compliant parts. Other examples may be snow removal, scrap haulers, production finished good haulers, right? So these are just some examples. Once again, you can look at this entire list at a later date. Then high risk scopes of work. So these are some examples of if you have a seller doing this type of work, we are saying that this is considered high risk. So masonry contractors, roofing contractors, excavation, crane rigging and lifting, resurfacing concrete, elevator services, robot installation, refurbish or repair, asbestos and lead remediation, confined space. And then let's make sure you pay close attention to the one at the very bottom. If you have a resident contractor on site with a long-term contract, we are considering those as also being high risk. So let's take a look at work instructions or a pre-task plan template, which is required. So if you have taken the 55030 class or the SCM updates course, you have noticed that there is now a difference in the contractual requirements if the scope of work is medium risk or if the scope of work is high risk. For instance, if the scope of work is medium risk, we no longer require a formal pre-task plan template, right? We require work instructions that list steps, associated hazards, and how the hazards are mitigated. We also do not require a safety Fema for every single task because the contract manager has identified the highest risk of this scope of work as medium. So just make sure you note that if the contract manager would like to expand the scope of work, a new contract with the correct contractual requirements will have to be established. As far as planning questions goes, they are required in certain instances, meaning if the seller's scope of work involves using barricades, bringing chemicals on site, utilizing power industrial vehicles while on site, using an apprentice or employee in training, roof access, or welding or hot work. If their task requires any of those, then they will have to fill out the planning questions, and the contract manager, which is you, will be required to give this form to the seller. Now, in regards to worker engagement for medium risk, the formal worker engagement form that GM has as a template is not required. However, it is required that the contractor has a documented hazard recognition form that is required to be filled out at the work location prior to starting work. In addition, for medium risk, it still requires GM's review and signature on the seller's form. Now, as for high risk, the requirements are essentially the same as they were previously with safety contract management requirements, but just to go over those again, if the seller has a high risk scope of work, then we're looking for work to be done on a pre-approved pre-task plan template. We require a safety Fema for each task. if with their safety FEMA, if the task is medium or high risk, we do require that the seller is filling out the planning questions. They are required to utilize a formal worker engagement form for the workers if the workers are doing medium or high risk tasks. And there is a requirement for GM signatures on the pre-task plan template for medium and high risk tasks. So keep in mind, you as the contract manager are signing a form whether it is for medium risk or high risk. So that has not changed. All right, so let's take a look. This is just a brief snapshot of the seller's minimum action summary based on the hazards within the task. So as you see here, low risk, once again, is 0 to 50. Medium risk is 51 to 160. High risk is 161 to 500. And unacceptable risk is above 500. Based on the risk level of the task they're doing, if you go over to minimum action summary, it tells the contractor specifically what they have to do, right? So if you have a scope of work or you have a task, that's medium risk, the contractor would have to do 1, 2, and 3 in low risk, as well as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 in medium risk. And the same thing for high. You would do everything required in low and medium, as well as high risk. So let's look at part 1 of the pre-task plan template, which is a job safety analysis. So for part 1, job safety analysis, it is the seller's process required for medium and high risk tasks in which key steps, hazards, and controls are identified. Emergency response plans are also developed during this phase. So here's a snapshot of part 1 job safety analysis. This is a snapshot of the template here. And we're just showing you here that this is section right here in red is where the key steps should be listed. So what should the seller include in the JSA form? So the seller should ensure that the key steps with the higher risk have been identified. We want to make sure that the seller identifies what steps should the workers take extra precaution. For example, verifying electrical wiring and de-energizing is a critical step. However, verifying that the area is swept after completion of the job is not a critical step. Both are steps that the workers are required to complete. However, the critical step is the electrical hazard versus housekeeping. The seller should ensure that all key steps, hazards, and method of control are completed. So when you have a seller submit to you this form and you're reviewing it, if all 3 boxes are not filled out, that's your first tell that you should reject this form and submit it back to the contractor or seller. So let's talk about the differences between a task, a job step, a hazard, and risk, and how are they linked together. So we're saying a task is a specific work assignment. For instance, replacing a valve, troubleshooting a programming fault, repairing an inoperable copier. Whereas a job step is a subpart of a task listing specific actions and activities required to accomplish the task. For instance, cutting and threading piping, elevating the piping to a work level, connecting the piping to a joint, and securing the pipe to the structure. All those are steps to an overall task. Then there is a hazard. A hazard is a potential source of harm or adverse health effects on a person or persons. For instance, if the task is mopping up the floor, then the water on the floor would present a potential slipping hazard to the person passing through it. So then the risk is defined as the chance, probability that a person will be harmed or experience an adverse health effect if exposed to the hazard. Part 2, Safety FEMA. So just a reminder, if the SOR has designated the scope of work of the project is medium risk, the seller is not required to perform safety FEMA calculations. But in that instance, all tasks will be assumed to be medium risk unless the seller performs a risk assessment to show that the task within the scope is low risk. So make sure you guys understand that. So if the SOR SOW says that the scope of work is medium, We don't require a safety FEMA for every single task because we know at maximum the task is medium risk. Also, reminder, safety FEMA calculations are required for all tasks by the seller if the seller's scope of work designates it as a high risk or construction. So we're just looking here at the definition once again of safety FEMA. Nothing has changed there. So we're saying risk equals severity potential multiplied by probability of occurrence, multiplied by frequency of exposure, multiplied by the number of people exposed. So when we're looking at part 2, we're looking for the seller to evaluate hazards within the task. They should be looking at it from a standpoint of what can cause harm to the workers while doing the task. Keep in mind we're focusing on the hazard, right? So severity potential of the hazard, probability of occurrence of the hazard, frequency of exposure to the hazard, and number of people exposed to the hazard. Once again, our focus is on the hazards. So when you look at safety FEMAs, what is required for sellers with high risk scope of work? So we're looking for the seller to complete the risk assessment, safety FEMA, from the hazards that they have listed in part 1 of the JSA. In the JSA, they should have also included critical identifiers on these higher risk steps. We're looking for them to have up to 6 different hazards listed. We want to produce a safety FEMA hazard assessment risk score for hazards that the workers may be exposed to while completing the task. Just make sure you note that the seller should not simply list one top hazard, right? The purpose of this assessment is to identify the majority of the hazards that the workers will be exposed to. For instance, we only require up to 6 because the hazards should have been well thought out and identified in the JSA. The purpose of the safety FEMA is to calculate what is the minimum seller's requirements based on the highest risk, right? So we only require up to 6, but make sure they're putting in there more than simply 1. So severity potential, the numerical values that a seller can use are 1, 2, 4, 6, 10, or 15. And severity potential is simply looking at the hazards without any controls in place. So here are some examples that we have of severity potential and how it can be used. Once again, the verbiage in the bracket are simply examples, right? Scores could be higher based on the specific task being performed. For instance, we're saying if someone is falling from heights above 10 feet, severity potential would be a 15. If the hazard was electrocution or confined space ventilation issues, exposure to toxic fumes or chemicals, arc flash, those are examples of hazards that we're saying, hey, that severity potential is more than likely going to be a 15. And we have an example in here, for instance, of a 4. A 4 for severity potential, we're saying, hey, this is probably a fall from less than 4 feet or up to the same level. Take a look at the additional examples there that we have for the other numerical values. Once again, these are examples. These are not etched in stone. These examples are task specific, so that number absolutely could change. For instance, you could work at heights at 6 feet, and depending on the exact location and what other hazards are around, if you fail, it could lead to a fatality. So we're not saying that only falls between 4 and 10 feet are a 10. Make sure that contractor specifically looks at the specific task that they're doing and the area that they're doing the task in. Probability of occurrence. We allow the numbers 2, 8, and 15 that the contractor can use. And this is where we look at the layers of controls in place. So some examples, we're saying a 15 would be used when there are no controls in place. A 8 can be used when the controls in place can be defeated by a single individual action, such as administrative controls like PPE, if you only have fall hazard training or pre-task plan training or pre-op inspections, or only danger tape, right? So a single action. whereas we're saying 2 can be used, which is defined as unlikely, when engineering controls represent a barrier between the hazard and the exposed individual. This rating is acceptable when multiple layers of controls are in place, such as controls that rely on more than one person or a checking process. Examples of numerous defined controls include documented training, daily visual and documented inspections, rescue plans, hot work, permit, safe work practices, at least one other control that involves a person, like a spotter, fire watch, certified rigger, in addition to a trained operator, a whole watch. So keep in mind, we're looking at engineering controls and multiple layers when you can use the number 2 for probability of occurrence. You, meaning the contractor, can use the number 2. So we've updated our definition of frequency of exposure. So frequency of exposure, the numbers or the values that the contractor can use are 2.5, 4, and 5, with the definitions respectively. 2.5 meaning only one time exposed to the hazard during the task. 4 being intermittently, which is more than once exposed to the hazard throughout the task. And 5 being constantly exposed to the hazard throughout the task. So some examples would be number 5. The workers exposed to the hazard throughout the task, such as working at heights, confined space, heavy welding. Maybe some hazards would be when they are working adjacent to a rig load or while erecting a steel building. So we're saying 4 hourly can be used when hazards where the risk is present more than once throughout the task, but not continuously. And then once again, 2.5, the workers only exposed one time. So then the last calculation we will look at is NP, which is number of people. So these are the number of people exposed to the hazard. So keep in mind, there's a difference between the number of people exposed to the hazard and the number of people working on the task, right? So just make sure you're clear on that and that the seller is clear on that as well. So for example, a crew of 16 electricians and helpers running conduit and pulling wire with 2 employees each in 3 different man lifts would score a 1 for the number of people exposed versus an 8. Why is that? Because a single event of falling from heights would only injure 1 to 2 workers, not all 16. Right? So they are not dependent on each other. They are actually independent of each other, which is why the number of people exposed to falling would be 1 to 2. So now let's take a look at the planning questions also identified in part 2. So just a reminder here, if you have a medium risk scope of work project, we do require that planning questions are filled out by the medium risk seller when the work instructions involves one of the following. So if the work instructions involves barricading, using chemicals, using powered industrial vehicles, using apprentices or employees in training, roof access, welding, or hot work, then the contract manager, which is you, will provide this form to the seller. The expectations is that the seller will fill out the form and the contract manager will review the form prior to allowing the contractor or seller to start work. So this is just a snapshot of the planning questions that I was referring to you guys. This is actually page 3 of our pre-task plan template. So reminder, this is the form the contract manager will provide to the medium risk seller. Now, what about high risk? What are the planning questions requirement for high risk? If you guys recall from the chart I showed you previously, we're saying if the scope of work is high risk, planning questions are required to be filled out by the seller for all medium and high risk tasks. So let's take a look at these planning questions. I'll tell you from the feedback from different calibrations, we see that there is a need to help support everyone in filling out the planning questions. What are the questions really asking? What should you be looking for as the contract manager when you're looking at planning questions? So number 1, I would say, first thing you need to make sure is that ensure that all questions have been answered. So keep in mind, these planning questions are simply thought starters and reminders for the seller. It is absolutely a reiteration that hazards and safe methods of control have been addressed. Anything that the seller answers yes to should have comments noted in the section directly to the right. So if I answer any of these questions yes, or if the seller answers any of these questions yes, the seller should also have notes to the right. So as we go through the planning questions, let's take a look at what you should expect to see as the contract manager reviewing this document. So planning question 1 is asking, is there a way to eliminate, substitute, or use engineering controls to eliminate or restrict exposure to the hazard? So if the contractor answered yes, it would indicate to you that the hazards have been identified and controls have been incorporated into the JSA in a way that they are eliminated or significantly reduced. So a comment you should expect to see would be something to the effect of included in the JSA, meaning no further action is required. If the seller did not continue with these, if the seller did not include these details in the JSA, the expectation is that the seller would need to make revisions to the JSA before proceeding. Question 2 is asking, are there work instructions, previous JSAs, or standardized work for this activity? So if the seller answered yes, it would indicate to you that there have been previous JSAs or standardized work developed which were included in the JSA. So a comment that you should expect to see would be something to the effect of see attached, meaning the seller has attached a separate document, or current JSA, meaning the current document that is in use is the standard work instructions for the task at hand. Question 3 is asking, are there any applicable GM risk mitigations included in the GM special safety conditions for this activity? So if the seller answered yes, it would indicate that some of the GM risk mitigations are included in the tasks that the workers are performing. So a comment you would expect to see is the seller filling out the drop-down box and should specifically identify what risk mitigations apply to the task, such as aerial lifts, barricading, etc. Just a note so that you guys remember, the applicable controls specified from the risk mitigations must be included in the JSA. Right? So if we have any specific GM requirements included in the special safety conditions that apply or in the risk mitigation sections that apply, this seller should have included those in the JSA. So just a reminder here, because if you looked at the question and said, hey, take a look at section 2.4. So this is just a snapshot of section 2.4. That's just a reminder to the seller of these are all risk mitigation where there are additional requirements that were included in your contract. And keep in mind, some of these risk mitigations apply to medium risk, but all of them apply to high risk. So once again, simply because they are medium risk, they still may have applicable planning questions. They may have to fill out the planning questions section because it will apply. Question 4. I would say this is the question that is usually confused by most individuals, both sellers and the GM contract managers. So let's go over this question. It is asking, are there any GM safety specifications included in the contract or scope of work related to the work to be performed? So if the seller answered yes, it would indicate that the scope of work includes some type of design, install safety specification for the work being performed. Keep in mind, this is in addition to whatever the risk mitigation requirements are specified in the special safety conditions. So if the seller did answer yes, you would expect to see the name of the other contractual requirement that they have to abide by. For instance, I know we have some document called Electrical Equipment Specification number 5E, section 8.0. Then we also have a document called Buyer's EL1, right? So just keep in mind, this question 4 has nothing to do with worker engagement or GM special safety conditions. This is saying, hey, were there any other contractual requirements that the seller had to abide by that was included in their SOR or SOW? So just to note as well, where applicable, These additional safety specifications must be detailed in the JSA. Question 5 is asking, does this work require assistance or support from an engineer, professional engineer, or safety professional? So if the seller answered yes, it would indicate that additional assistance is required from an engineer or safety professional. And in the comments sections, you would expect to see what was the specific requirement that was told to the seller, right? So what did the engineer, professional engineer, or safety personnel require the seller to do? That should be included in the JSA. So some comments you would expect to see would be something to the effect of maybe see attached if it's a separate document, or just a note that their recommendations, designs, procedures, drawings, and or specifications will be incorporated in the JSA. Right, so that's what you are expecting to see as the contract manager viewing this document. Planning question 6 is asking, is there a need for engineering drawings, rigging calculations, anchorage point calculations, assessment of critical equipment, licenses, certification, safety data sheets, or other supportive documentation to be attached to this JSA? If the contractor answered yes, it would indicate to you that additional documentation is required prior to the start of the work, including details such as rigging calculations, engineered drawings, critical equipment inspections, etc. So a comment you may expect to see if they answered yes would be something to the effect of see attached. Should be noted in a comment box, and whatever the required drawings, calculations, safety data sheets, or any other documentation should be attached to the JSA. Question 7 is asking, for any critical equipment or personal protective equipment used, have you verified that required preventative maintenance has been completed? If pre-use or pre-operational inspection is required, is that a part of the work instructions? So if the seller answered yes to this, it will indicate that the project will be using equipment that will require PPE or the use of critical equipment as defined in the special safety conditions, which requires preventative maintenance. In addition, an inspection by the worker on the PPE and or equipment is included in the worker's work instructions. So a comment you would expect to see for question 7 would be maybe something as simple as see attached. But just a note, the JSA should detail the PPE and or checks required by the worker. The seller should be able to show you, as the contract manager, the preventative maintenance records depicting that the equipment meets the contractual requirements. So when we talk about this, we're not expecting the seller to say, oh, well, I didn't know. This is a part of your contractual requirements. You should already know, and it should be included in the JSA. Question 8 is asking, does this activity require a permit, such as confined space, roof access, hot work? So if the seller answered yes, that would indicate that some type of permit is required for the task. And what you would expect to see as the contract manager in the comments section would be the seller is listing the permits required for the task specifically. Just a note there, details must be included in the JSA. Question 9 is asking, for work involving hazardous energy, have you considered all energy sources and the safe method of control or verification? So if the seller answered yes, it will indicate to you that a thorough analysis has taken place to control exposure to hazardous energy during the task. So you should expect to see in the comments section something to the effect of listed in the JSA. And just a note there, the JSA must include procedures to control and verify all hazardous energies will be safely isolated. Question 10 is asking, is there a need for specialized training, and have the assigned workers received such training? An answer yes would indicate that the workers have received the specialized training that is required for the task. So some comments you may expect to see would be a list of the specialized training that is required by the workers. such as crane operator training, fork truck operator, lockout training, MPS, SCS training, fall hazard training, aerial lift operator, etc. Question 11. So question 11, as you recall, is a new question that we added in our pretest plan template 5.0. If you are not using 5.0, you will not see this question listed. So question 11 now says, does the task involve the use of a powered industrial vehicle? If yes, have you validated that the vehicle has been inspected, maintenance records in the past year for all safety equipment, such as brakes, lights, horns, sirens, etc.? And does the JSA include mitigation if working or parked on an incline? So if the seller answered yes to this question, it would indicate that powered industrial vehicles, based on the definition listed in the risk mitigation section, will be used during the task, and that the vehicle's associated safety equipment maintenance records have been validated, and that the JSA includes mitigation for vehicles working or parked on an incline. So some comments you would expect to see would be something to the effect of included in the JSA or see attached. Just a note to you guys, the seller must be able to show you as the contract manager valid inspections and maintenance records within the last year for the vehicles in question. Section 2.7. This section is used if there is a need for additional documentation or for additional action items. So now let's take a look at the last part of part 2, which is the signatures, which is required. Keep in mind, we're looking at it from a standpoint of the sellers approving it and GM reviewing. So, work instructions review, just a reminder there, for a medium risk scope of work, just a reminder that there is one GM signature required on the seller's work instructions form prior to allowing the start of work. For high risk, they should be using this pre-task plan template or a pre-approved, pre-task plan template. And it should be a section on there for seller's approval, which include direct supervisor, prime seller representative, and the seller safety representative. Depending on the size of the project, this individual may be the same person. If the safety Fema or hazard assessment score is 161 to 500, there will be an additional prime seller leadership signature required. Keep in mind, the secondary signature for high-risk task, this is an additional individual. It cannot be the same individual that signed for the 51 to 160 section that's orange and medium here. So as far as GM review goes, for GM review, we are looking for one GM review signature is required for medium risk, so for the 51 to 160. And then a secondary signature is required, which once again cannot be the same person as the first signature. So a second signature is required if the scores are 161 to 500. So when you look at pre-task plans, let's do a review here. Work instructions / JSA submittal and signature minimum acceptable requirements. So just to update for you guys, we are looking for this information to be fully completed with the seller's signatures prior to submittal for GM for review. So if the seller has not signed the form yet, you guys should not even be looking at it. Return that back to the seller. They need to sign off on their form first. If the pre-task plan has been accepted at one GM site, a different site will need to verify that all of the hazards are listed and mitigated for that current site. So simply because a seller comes to you and say, oh, well, I'm a service agreement firm at another site as well, and they accepted it, that's totally different. It's a totally different site. So it is absolutely okay to reject that pre-task plan. Make sure that that contractor or seller verifies it for your site. And there will be times where the verbiage will be the exact same. However, that seller has to do their due diligence to make sure that it is up to date. Just a note as well, Electronic signatures are acceptable as far as signing a pre-task plan template, but make sure you note that some sites may opt to change this requirement. So if they have it documented in their SCM documented program for their site that they will not be accepting electronic signatures, then for that specific site, the answer is they will not be accepting it. But from a global standpoint, global safety contract management, it is acceptable. So let's talk about part 3, worker safety engagement. So just a reminder here, when it comes to low risk, let's look at these requirements. So you know the update that's coming up or that has happened with safety contract management. So based on that, we're reminding everybody that low risk tasks are not required to fill out a worker engagement form. They can simply utilize the verbal take two process, or if the contractor wants to require them to have some type of documentation, the contractor can mandate that they use the worker engagement card. We, as far as global safety, as far as the SCM team, no longer require the use of the worker engagement card or form or to sign in and out. So none of those are required anymore if a seller is performing a low risk task. Now, if the seller is performing a medium risk, right? So now let's say that you have a contractor that has a medium risk scope of work. So the previous example, we were talking about, hey, this is a low risk contractor, so they have a low risk scope of work. Now we're talking about a contractor that has a medium risk scope of work. So what we're saying is medium risk project sellers are not required to use GM's formal worker engagement template. So they don't have to use the nice fancy one that we have included in part in 5.0 of the pre-task plan template. They don't have to use that one or have a pre-approved one. However, they are required to have some sort of documented hazard recognition form that will be filled out at the work location prior to starting work. It must be used by all workers performing medium risk tasks. So just a requirement there. So they don't have to have a formal worker engagement form, but this is our way of making them have some type of form without requiring them to use our specific template. Now they can opt to use our template if they would like, but they have to have something. So for high risk, once again, if we're looking at it from a standpoint that the contractor project manager, you guys have a high risk scope of work, if the scope of work is high risk, we do require the use of the formal pre-approved worker engagement template. So how does that look, right? So for high risk, how does the worker engagement form look? What am I supposed to do? What should I be looking for, right? So just a reminder to you guys, worker engagement is a process to drive floor level engagement of workers. The primary focus is on hazard recognition, safe work zone identification, and management of change. So here are some examples of safe work zones, right? So safe work zone is a method in which the person or team identifies and controls all hazardous energies and movement that may interact with it or its team. Your safe work zone is always changing, and you should be aware of that. So depending on where you are, you could have an injury that could possibly happen from above the head. So in this example, you see that forks are lifted during movement. You may have a hazard that's right in front of you, right? Knocking against something. You may be about to run into something, right? So going through something. Another example is something is around you, right? Something is very close to you. So be careful there. Look behind you at all times, right? So there could be a risk of you falling backwards. There's also a possible risk of below the foot, right? So if you have an unlevel floor that you're working on or that you're near, make sure you're very conscious of your safe work zone at all times. Once again, that area is constantly changing. So when you think of safe work zone, it's more like an imaginary box around you, right? It provides a safety margin to help you identify hazards and reduce risks as you move in a dynamic work environment. So reminder, everyone, our safe work zone expands and contracts based on what we're doing, what we're holding, or while we're walking. It does not always cover your entire body. It can restrict it into body parts as well. So in this pictorial, you can see it's a pinch point right here for this worker. A way to aid in that is to limit the size of your safe work zone to reduce risk. Also, make sure you continuously evaluate your safe work zone as you move to perform your task or while working or walking. So this is just a pictorial of the worker engagement form template that we have available. It is a 2-page form or 1-pager front and back. So let's go through how this form looks and what you should be looking for with it. So let's look at the flow for worker engagement. So we're saying the workers meet at the location and they participate in the start of shift meeting. Then they will receive their job assignments and go to their location where the work is to be performed. Then they're going to review the worker engagement form and address and take a look at any new hazards that were not previously listed on the JSA. So we're going to add, the workers should be asking themselves, are there any new hazards? If there aren't any new hazards, great. The worker can now start working and continue with the job as planned. However, if there are new hazards, the worker must stop immediately. And then they must use the back side of the worker safety engagement form to document the change. So when we say document the change, everything should be filled out in this section, which means we're looking for the steps to perform the task, the hazards, and how they will control the hazards. Next, they must notify their supervisor, and their supervisor needs to sign off on how they mitigated the hazard that they found, the additional hazard. Once supervisor has signed off, then they can start working. So as we look at the form, once again, the form is for workers to identify additional hazards not listed on the pre-task plan, right? So if you have a hazard listed in the JSA and in there it tells you what the hazard is and how it's mitigated, you don't have to list, or the seller would not have to list that same hazard on the worker engagement form, right? Because it's already been listed and addressed. So we're looking for them to have any new hazards that were not previously mentioned. The form itself verifies if there is any management change to the pre-task plan. It also takes a look at and reminds all crew members that they must be trained prior to starting work, as stated in questions 1 through 4. And then while they're at the work locations, they're filling out questions 1 through 16 for additional hazards that may be around. So 1 through 16 is typically additional hazards that have nothing to do with the task, right? These are additional hazards that can be found from anywhere based on your location, right? So I'm doing work at column AB, and I have an additional hazard now because there's a roof leak here. And I didn't know it was going to be a roof leak here, so now I have an additional hazard. So the worker needs to fill out that form and contact their foreman to sign off before they can proceed. Keep in mind, having a roof leak had nothing to do with the work assignment of, let's say, installing lights. However, it's an additional hazard that we found, and it was not included on the JSA, which is why it should be included on the worker engagement form. So we just need to make sure when we look at the worker engagement form during our SOT or one of our random walks that the form is completely filled out. So once again, 1 through 16 is asking random questions about additional hazards that may be found that are not included in the JSA. So these are addressed in section 3.3, which are the 16 questions. If the worker answers any of the questions yes, then there needs to be section 3.4 and 3.5 filled out. Right? So 3.4 is just verbiage to you, right? It's verbiage letting the workers know, hey, you're going into a management and change process. Make sure you stop and notify your leadership right now. So the expectations would be that the workers and the foreman at some point fills out the steps, hazards, elimination measures, and signs off on the form. Once again, all of these boxes have to be filled out correctly or the worker should not be starting work. We do have a little a caveat in there or a little note. So section, the very bottom of section 3.4, right? So right before it says 3.5, there's a little box here that says very clearly, if the change introduces a new medium or high risk hazard, the worker must stop. The direct seller or supervisor must amend the work instructions or JSA. Then the expectation is that the seller would then recalculate the risk assessment and the safety Fema and have a signed acceptance by a GM contract manager prior to starting work. Right? So this is our way to prevent task creep. So we don't want workers and supervisors simply to start writing stuff on the back of the form and continuing to work. That's a violation of our SCM policy. So when you look at the worker engagement form in section 3.6, you have a section here where the workers sign their name, they print their name, and then sign their name. So once they have done this, they can actually start working. Once they have completed the task, the expectation is that the worker will initial that the task has been completed, acknowledging that they follow all steps in the JSA and pretest plan or standardized work. Then there is a debrief that occurs with the leadership, the contractor leadership or direct supervisor, and the workers, and they work together to answer questions 1 through 4. The intent of this is to acknowledge the need to update or improve the work instructions. To make sure that if they answer yes, once again, they should have comments in. If they answer yes to anything, if they answer yes to questions 1, 2, or 4, the expectation then is that the supervisor would sign the bottom of the worker engagement form. The supervisor may add additional notes if they would like to, and the seller retains the worker engagement form. So let's kind of go over these steps again for worker engagement. Step 1 is that the crew will walk the job prior to the start of shift. Step 2 is they would discuss individual or as a team the safe work zones. Step 3 is that they will identify additional hazards or new hazards. Step 4 is that they will write in any hazards not included in the JSA form. Step 5, during the task, they would stop if a new hazard is identified or a deviation from the JSA is necessary. All right. So now let's take a look at some of the common pre-task plan mistakes that we see. So some of the common ones, just to name a few, we typically see that the safety Fema lists tasks and not hazards. A lot of times we see scoring is incorrect or biased low. We usually see sellers using the old pre-task plan form. We usually find that the JSA is too general and missing the key steps, hazards, and controls. Sometimes we see the JSA is written like a novel, where it's like extremely too much detail in there. We often see that medium and high risk planning questions are not answered or answered incompletely. We often find it also that the risk mitigations requirements are not specified. And then we often also find that we are missing the GM signatures. So let's take a look. So the question is, how should the description area be filled out? So a correct way we're saying is something to the effect of fabricating supports for piping and other mechanical components and equipment, and install supports using ladders and aerial lifts. That's what we would expect to see from a seller. A lot of times what we see is something that simply said install overhead piping. So you as the contract manager can absolutely reject what they submit to you if they submit to you something that is too vague as far as a task or description. When you think about work instructions or the JSAs, let's take a look at some do's and don'ts. So one thing we want to do is we want to ensure that the work instructions and JSAs don't include unnecessary details, right? We want to make sure that they are not hard to read, because if they are hard to read, they'll probably be ignored. So a best practice, once again, not a requirement, but a best practice, is talk to your seller and let them know that, hey, for the most part, if you can, let's try to make the JSA 2 pages or less, right? So the goal of this is to prevent the development of a textbook type of JSA. All right, we don't want to see that the seller is describing every single possible activity but more specific to what the workers are doing today or for the task. A goal of the JSA would simply be to outline the key steps of a specific task, identify the hazards involved in each step, and specify how each hazard is to be controlled. That is the goal of the JSA. So here's another example of what we typically see. So they have a really good task description in this example, where they're going to perform maintenance on low voltage substation. They're going to clean and lubricate the circuit breakers. They're going to test wiring cable for continuity and test circuit breaker functionality. So they did a good job on the task description. However, they didn't fill out anything else, right? So we don't have the company name on here. We don't have a job number or name. We don't have a contact. We don't have a start or end date, a supervisor, none of that. So if this is submitted to you as a contract manager, you should absolutely reject this information as well. So this is what we're looking for, right? Where all information is filled in and they have a really good project task description. So looking at this form here, we found a couple errors in number 3 and number 4, right? So what did we find? Risk mitigations are not listed, right? And we also found that the comments don't align with the question. So in this example, there were risk mitigations that applied, but the contractor or the seller said they did not apply. Also, when we talked about question 4 before, remind you guys, we said these are requirements for specifications that are above the special safety conditions, right? So in this example, they listed that the specifications that they're talking about are the special safety conditions. So we have here a misunderstanding with the seller of what the question is really asking. So once again, this would be something that is done incorrectly by the seller, and we just need to coach him or her in how to do this correctly. So if you go back about 30 slides is when we went over question 4, so you can kind of coach them on what you're looking for this question and help them know that this question probably is not applicable to their example. So in this examples here, they do have the specified risk mitigations listed, right? But they don't have a couple things. So all yes questions do not have comments, right? So question 5 here says yes, but nothing's written right here. And then question 4 here, once again, the question that most sellers don't fully understand and the GM contract managers usually don't understand as well. We're looking for additional specs, right? Additional specs above the risk mitigations. They gave us answers to risk mitigations. Anything with a risk mitigation should be in question number 3. In addition, worker engagement is not a GM safety spec, right? So we're looking for GM safety spec, design spec. That's what we're looking for. We should never see worker engagement as an answer for number 4. All right, so this is a really good example of where the seller did a really good job of listing the key steps for the job. In addition, they have a critical identifier listed for the ones that we really want the worker to pay close attention to, right? Where they can be seriously injured or fatality, right? Because they even have the hazard here of arc flash, burns, etc. So we're not saying that, if you slip, trip, or fall, it's not important or it's not a hazard there, or if you get a cut or lacerations, there's not a hazard there. No, those are hazards as well, and the worker could absolutely get hurt there. However, we want to emphasize, hey, where could you have a major life-altering injury, or where can you possibly have a fatality if you do not follow this instruction correctly? So they did a really good job with this one. This is another example we're looking at here where they answered it correctly. As you can see, this is on one of our older forms, but you have it answered correctly for question 3 as far as the risk mitigation requirements. And then they actually had an error. Oh, here you go. Sorry about that, guys. they actually had an error and answered number 4 incorrectly again, right? So this is worker, once again, they're talking about safety specs being the safety plan and the worker engagement process. Once again, these are real life examples that we're showing you that a lot of people don't understand question 4. So we just need to provide guidance to the seller, and this is us providing guidance to you guys as a contract manager of what you should see in question number 4. Planning questions as well. These are answered very good, and they have details. So if they have a yes, they have answers as to why. This one they answered no, so that's why they don't have a comment there. Um, so really good job for here. In section 2.7, you don't see this, well, I typically haven't seen this section used a lot, but when you guys do see it used, just take a look. Some things you would expect to see here is a specific action, a specific responsible person, and a specific date, right? So action may be roof access training or arc flash training certification every 3 years. Um, so some type of action that is required from the seller. Keep in mind the seller is using this area to add in additional details. All right, so let's take a look at some example of safety FEMA scoring. I would say the biggest area that we can support you guys on is a clear understanding of a safety FEMA, how things are scored, certain things you should challenge. The safety FEMA score overall is owned by the seller, right? So the contractor comes up with a score. However, there will be times where they absolutely need your guidance and support um, to challenge them on what they score the system at, right? So how are they scoring these hazards? Are they scoring them correctly? So we have a couple of examples here. Let's go through them together. So example 1, we're saying food preparation. So in this example, we're saying that the seller said that their task is going to be something to the effect of preparing, cooking, and serving food. So just take a note here. They are considering the number of people exposed to the hazard, not the crew that is working in the kitchen. Two totally different things. So for their task of preparing, cooking, and serving food, they found that their hazards were possible hazards were laceration of fingers, burns from the grill or the oven, some sprains and strains from lifting some of the heavy products that they need, and possible slips, trips, and falls, right? So they calculated the safety FEMA. They said, hey, the highest risk score we have is a 32, so they are low risk. But let's kind of walk through and figure out how do they get these numbers for lacerations to fingers, right? So why did they say laceration to fingers was a 32? So the job step we're saying is, hey, in this job step, they are slicing, chopping, and dicing food using essentially meat slicers. So let's talk about why severity potential in this one is a 4 and probability of occurrence is not an 8, right? So why is probability of occurrence a 2? So severity potential, we said was a 4 because without controls, a food preparation worker using a meat slicer could lose a digit on their on the slicer, right? So they could possibly lose a digit on their finger while they're using a slicer if they didn't use it correctly. So severity potential we're saying is a 4. Probability of occurrence we said was a 2. So the probability of occurrence was a 2 due to the multiple levels of control, including engineering controls, which are the guards on the meat slicers, and administrative controls such as training and standardized work procedures for the workers. We said frequency of exposure was a 4 because the workers are intermittently exposed to the hazard of slicing, losing a digit of finger, while they are performing the task of prepping, cooking, and serving food. We said the number of people exposed was 1 to 2, so we're going to use the number 1 there because although there's a crew of 10 people, only 1 is exposed to this hazard, right? So these are numbers that we're saying, hey, this is what the seller came up with as how they scored food services, and to us, these all make sense as far as using these numerical values. Once again, the responsibility of coming up with a safety Fema score is of the seller, not of the GM representative. But we do want to walk you guys through exactly how some of the scoring is done and how it should be looked at from the contractor's view. So just a note here, the probability would have been an 8, which is this one right here, if there were not guards in place or the workers were not trained. So keep in mind, probability of occurrence looks at multiple layers of control, right? So because we listed multiple layers of control and one of those were engineering controls, we used a 2. However, if we did not have multiple layers or this engineering control in place, this number for probability of occurrence would have been an 8. All right, so take a look at another example. Let's say a contractor presents to you this information. They're saying that, hey, I have a task of setting up metrology gauges, right? And while doing that, my possible hazards that my workers may run into are electrocution, struck by moving vehicles, crushed or pinch point, and strains. So let's kind of look at how they had the numbers for electrocution, right? Does it make sense? So they have 150 for electrocution. They have severity potential of 15, probability of occurrence of a 2, frequency of exposure of a 5, and number of people at 1 for a total of 150, and that is their highest risk score. So let's just take a look at electrocution. So in this job step, we're saying they are troubleshooting and repairing and replacing the electrical device on the electrical panel. So they're saying their possible hazards electrocution. So severity potential, they said a 15. So they said a fatality could occur if proper energy isolation and safe electrical practices were not followed. So severity potential, we're saying, is a 15. Probability of occurrence in this example, we're saying this is a 2 because there are multiple layers of control in place, including engineering controls such as lockout, which isolates workers from the hazard, administrative controls such as training and PPE. Frequency of exposure in this example, we said it was a 5. We said the worker is exposed to an electrocution hazard constantly for the duration of the task. So just a note here, although we noted lockout as a means of control and probability of occurrence, which is this one here, in this task we are assuming that there will be constant exposure to electrical hazard from a nearby source that cannot be de-energized. Therefore, we are saying that they are exposed to some level of electrocution hazard for the entire constantly throughout the task, right? So make sure you guys understand that because there are different numbers that the seller can use based on the task they're doing and the hazards involved. So in this one, as I mentioned, frequency of exposure they said was constantly because although they de-energized exactly where they were working, in this example, there are additional electrical hazards nearby that they could not de-energize. So that's why they use the number 5 for constantly. Number of people, they said was 1 because the setup involves 2 crew members. And for NP, 1 for us means 1 to 2. Just a note there, the probability of occurrence would be an 8 if it were not for multiple layers of control, right? So because we have multiple layers, we use the 2 here. But once the seller does not have multiple layers, then we make sure that they know that they cannot use that number 2. Also note here that although the score is 150 for the highest risk, which is medium risk, the seller is still required to abide by the electrical requirements in the special safety conditions and fill out the planning questions. So let's use the exact same example that we just had, and let's talk about if frequency of exposure was a 4, right? So if frequency of exposure is a 4, that now makes the highest risk for electrocution to be a 120. So what if frequency of exposure is a 4? Give me an example of what that looks like. So we're saying frequency of exposure equals 4 would mean that the worker is exposed to the electrocution hazard intermittently throughout the task, meaning the worker is exposed more than once but not constantly. So if we had the exact same example, but we took away the fact that there is an additional electrical source, we're saying that the worker is exposed to electrocution only during de-energizing and re-energizing, which is more than once but not constantly. The worker would not be performing the task while it's live, and it's above 50 volts that the worker can come in contact with. So what we're saying is frequency of exposure. If the frequency of exposure, if the electrocution hazard is directly what they are working on, right? So they have de-energized it, they're working on it, and they re-energized it. So they're not exposed to this electrical hazard the entire time. They're only exposed to it when they're de-energizing and re-energizing, which is intermittently. So if we had the exact same example for the metrology gauges, the exact same example, we would say if there was not a nearby energy source, and all the energy was de-energized, an acceptable score for frequency of exposure would be a 4. So once again, the exact same example that we just went over with metrology gauges, we're just saying, hey, let me kind of explain to you guys where a number 4 can be used and is acceptable. So that would be an acceptable answer from the seller if they wanted to use the number 4. All right, so now let's look at another example. Let's talk about chemical movement. So let's say what the job step. Now in this example, I didn't give you guys a table showing you 5 or 6 different hazards involved. I'm just saying that, hey, we're just going to evaluate one of the hazards from this task. So the one hazard that we're going to investigate a little bit more is the hazard of eye, skin, and inhalation burns from accidental exposure to XYZ biocide. So when I say XYZ, that's just the name of the biocide. Just like if you said Bruce's painting, right? So what is the actual name of the biocide? So that's why I just put in parentheses XYZ. So in this job step, the worker is responsible for moving the biocides, flocculants, and acids to other water treatment chemicals with a cart or a fork truck. So they're basically responsible for moving, transporting the actual the chemicals themselves. So in this example, let's talk about why the chemical XYZ biocide, why severity potential was a 4, and why probability of occurrence is an 8. So just a reminder, biocide is corrosive and can cause serious burns from excessive exposure. So we said severity potential was a 4 in this example. And so we're saying a 4 is based on the exposure limits from the SDS of this specific biocide, right? So all biocides are not the same, right? Their SDSs are not the same. Once again, SDS is safety data sheet. So we're saying for this specific biocide, because we are evaluating this specific task, so this specific hazard is using this biocide, we're saying severity potential is a 4. We're saying probability of occurrence is a 8 due to the exposure limit being less than 100% and higher than or equal to 50% of the limit. We're saying frequency of exposure is 2.5, which is one time, because we're only transporting it to one area. Just a reminder here that this is one step of the worker's task, which is why frequency of exposure is not a 4 or a 5. If the entire task for the worker were to transport the biocide, then the frequency of exposure would yield a different score. So keep in mind, you can kind of go back to when we said the difference between a task and a step, right? So this is just one part of their job. It's not their entire job, which is why this was 2.5. And if their entire job or their entire task was to just move chemicals all day, then this number would absolutely be a 5. Number of people exposed are 1 to 2 who are transporting the chemicals. So just a note, when it comes to industrial hygiene, it is truly important that you guys utilize the physical chemical risk scoring and contact your environmental lead for support, right? So what we decided was that we needed a separate risks evaluation sheet when it comes to industrial hygiene to better support the scoring system. So when you see everything that I have here in red, that is from our physical chemical risk scoring. So once again, when it comes to industrial hygiene, I highly suggest you guys talk to your environmental lead for support. All right, so let's look at this other example. So the task involves steel erection of a 1-story building. So let's evaluate how we have a 150 for falling from heights, right? So falling from heights using a JLG, we have a 15, a 2, a 5, and a 1. So in this one, we're saying the job step is using the JLG man lift, spud, wrenches, spanners, and other hand tools, insert and tighten fasteners, and structural steel members, right? So the hazard is falling from 12 feet. So if you look at severity potential, we said that was a 15 because if the worker falls from the man lift, a fatality could occur. We said severity potential was a 2 because there are a number of controls in place, including standardized work, which is their JSA, 100% tie-off, which is the engineering control. In this example, we're saying they already have barricadings and signs. The worker attended fall protection training. There is a ground person who's competent. They've inspected the lift, right? So they've done everything they were supposed to do. So we're saying severity potential is a 2. The frequency of exposure to falling from heights. So the task itself, they are exposed to the hazard of falling the entire time, so that is constantly. The number of people exposed to falling is a person or people that are in the man lift, so that number is 1. So just a note here, just a reminder, probability of occurrence is 2 in this scenario due to the multiple layers of control being used while working at heights. Once again, we talked about the JSA, but more importantly, we're saying that they followed the risk mitigation measures that are listed in the special safety conditions, risk mitigation sections, and training. So because they've done all that, we're saying, hey, an injury would be unlikely due to the engineering controls and administrative controls. So it's really important that you, as the reviewer of these scores, understand when a worker or when a seller can use the number 2 and when they cannot use the number 2. So what you're truly looking for is the multiple controls that they have in place. And if you don't understand, then ask the contractor or seller. Ask them, hey, how did you come up with this number? Why do you have this number as a 2? You tell me what your multiple controls are that are in place. Make sure you're comfortable accepting the score. Don't simply accept what they hand to you. All right, so in this example 5, we're looking at robot installation, supervision, and closure integration. So let's kind of evaluate this laceration from a blade, right? So the numbers we have 2, 8, 4, and 1, which yields a 64. So let's kind of look at how they got the number 64. So the step that this hazard affects is, or that this hazard is associated with, is the worker would be integrating closures of robot cells using wire fabric, expanded metal, and sheet metal as required. Their possible hazard is laceration from the sheet metal edges. So severity potential we said was a 2 because the handling of sharp objects, which is sheet metal in this example, have potential for cuts and lacerations. Probability of occurrence we said is an 8. So why is that an 8? Because there are no engineering controls that can be put in place to minimize the risk of being cut for handling sheet metal beyond training and PPE. And both of those are administrative controls. We said frequency of exposure is a 4 because the hazard of being cut is not constant, but only when the sheet metal is being handled, which is intermittently throughout the day. And the number of people exposed to being cut or a laceration is only the one person that will be handling the sheet metal for installation. Once again, independently, right? So just a note there, the probability of occurrence is an 8 in this scenario because high-level resistant gloves, PPE, and training are solely administrative controls. If a single person fails to follow directions or procedure, an injury is possible. In order to lower the probability score to a 2, the seller would need to devise a safer handling scheme involving 2 people instead of 1. Or they could also possibly, another possibility would be to provide sheet metal cutting equipment which automatically deliver rounded edges with no potential for lacerations, right? So keep in mind, once again, we're looking at what are the layers of control they have in place, and there will be times where just from the nature of the task, there aren't a lot of layers of control that you can put in place that are both robust and cost effective, right? So with enough money, I agree, you can engineer and put in enough controls, but then you may also be out of business. So just keep that in mind when contractors, once again, when they submit to you these numbers, challenge them and ask them how they come up with some of these scores. All right. So we looked at safety FEMA examples here. So now that you guys are experts because you looked at the examples, let's look at some common mistakes that we see when it comes to safety FEMAs. So these are safety FEMA scores that are submitted to you guys as the contract manager. So here's an example here, one we see all the time, I would say, where they say the hazard is to isolate the designated circuit breaker, clean and grease designated circuit breaker, and re-energize the circuit breaker. We are saying that this is 100% incorrect, right? So they did not list any hazards. They basically listed steps or tasks. So you as a contract manager should actually reject this back to the seller because the tasks are listed and not hazards. All right, here's another example. We're saying hazards are slips, trips, and falls, quality inspections of OEM parts, sorting of OEM parts. So they did a good job with slips, trips, and falls because yes, that is a hazard, and those are some scoring that, it could be applicable. However, once again, they did not list they did not list hazards for all items. Line item 2 and 3 are steps. They are not hazards. So once again, you as a contract manager should reject this back to the seller because because the tasks are listed and not hazards. The next one here, we have struck by conveyor, silica, hearing loss, muscle strain, pinch point cuts. So a pretty decent job with listing what the hazards are. However, if you take a look, one thing they have on there is silica. And we're saying, hey, just a note here, they underestimated the severity potential for silica. So silica is a known carcinogen. The contract manager should actually reach out to the IH lead, to the industrial hygiene lead for support if needed. This form should be rejected back to the seller, right? So we understand contract managers, you may need support from other contract managers on knowing if the contractor scored something correctly, right? So once again, reach out to your IH, your industrial hygiene specialist at your site. Or your function to better understand, hey, did the contractor or seller lowball this number or is it truly acceptable? I can tell you in this example, silica is not a 2. All right, so let's take a look at this example where they have hazards of falling from heights, back strain, cut, struck by a scissors lift, electrical voltage 120 volts, and electrocution. So they did a good job with most of these, but once again, electrical voltage 120 volts, that is not a hazard. Once again, you as a contract manager should reject this back to the seller. All right, so what are some common errors that we see repeatedly and how can we support the seller in resolving them? Now keep in mind, we're not talking means and methods, we're talking about supporting the seller in a better understanding of the requirements so that you as a contract manager don't have to keep redoing it for them over and over again or supporting them over and over again, but guiding them on understanding what they're doing wrong and how to fix it. So some common errors we see, and we talked about this earlier, that the seller's JSA is too vague, right? So a bad example of a key step that sometimes people put things such as maintain the machine, right? So that should be like a tell to you that something's wrong. So they can resolve this by simply applying clear, steady steps for the pre-task plan. So suggest to them to break down the task into steps. From those steps, determine which ones are key for the worker. Example, the logical sequence of the activity, as if it were a movie, for instance. So, for instance, number 1 would be clean the machine with a pressure washer. Number 2 would be replace the worn parts as required. Number 3 would be apply lubrication. Number 4 would be run a test to verify the machine operates, right? So logical sequential order. Some other common errors we see, the seller's JSA include actions that are not related to activity. We see things sometimes that say, when walking the site, it is not allowed to run. Well, what does that have to do with my specific task as a worker? So we can help resolve that. We need to coach the seller to simply focus on the specific steps involved in the task and related hazards and controls, not general comments. So if we kind of show them again the format that we're looking for, which are steps, hazards, and method of control, we would expect to see step is to mobilize material, tools, and work team to the job site. A hazard would be slips, trips, and falls on uneven working surfaces. And the method of control is to remove obstacles where possible, eyes on path, do not run or rush. So that's what we would expect to see. A lot of times this is what we end up seeing. Once again, this is us coaching the seller so that they understand the expectations at GM. So a couple more we typically see are general statements in the JSA that do not point to a specific action. So sometimes we may see something that simply says, take care. Well, what are you really telling the worker to do? So the seller should apply clear and specific safety controls for the JSA. So a suggestion would be to add something that says, yield right of way to all vehicles, observe the 2-foot rule, establish eye-to-eye contact with vehicle drivers, and wait for the wave. So those are specific instructions. Those are things that you're telling the worker to do, right? So we just need to, once again, coach the seller on the expectations of the JSA. So some common errors also, the seller develops lengthy JSAs covering a wide scopes of work that include every remote possibility. This is an absolute no-no. So we can help resolve this by verifying that work instructions JSA focus on a specific task at hand, not every task that the trade could do. So those are just a couple examples of common errors and how to resolve those. And when I say resolve those, I mean providing guidance to the seller on how they need to fix the JSA. Because keep in mind, if we don't let the seller know that what they're submitting to us is incorrect, they're going to keep submitting incorrect information to us. So just some highlights of what we just went through. Once again, the seller develops the work instructions or pre-task plan. You as the GM representative simply accept it or reject it. Our goal as the GM representative is simply to identify shortcomings and problems, not methods, right? So we are giving them suggestions. We are ensuring that hazards are listed on the safety Fema and not task. We are ensuring that risk mitigations are specified and applicable for task. And for scoring, just a reminder, for 0 to 50, which is low risk, no GM signature is required. For 51 to 160, there is 1 GM signature required. And for 161 to 500, which is high risk, there is 2 GM review signatures required. Once again, GM reviews, the seller approves. So what is your role once again for pre-task plans? You are to assist in the review process and sign off a seller's work instructions or pre-task plans. You are to identify shortcomings and not problems. Remember that GM is not approving the work instructions or pre-task plans, but we are reviewing and accepting them. Just a reminder, work instructions, pre-task plans, worker engagement forms, etc. are all owned by the seller. GM does not retain copies of these documents, right? So these are not GM documents. These are all the contractors or sellers' documents. They are responsible for them. They are responsible for making sure that their workers are trained on them and how to utilize them. GM reviews the paperwork of the seller. We don't own it. We don't retain copies. They are not ours. So let's talk about risk mitigations. So if you took a look at the medium risk safety requirements document, which is our new contractual document, or you took a look at the risk mitigation section in the special safety conditions, it goes over the requirements that GM is telling the seller on what we expect them to do, right? So if you take a look on our share drive, SharePoint, under contractual documents, you'll see special safety conditions 2019. So that's the most recent copy. So just a reminder here, we're going to do an overview right now of the GM risk mitigations. Reminder to you guys that this is a global safety requirements and there is a difference between safety and regulations. Just because you meet regulatory requirements doesn't mean it's 100% safe. The purpose of GM risk mitigations is to establish processes that may go slightly above federal regulatory standards based on previous incidents. Where regulatory requirements are more stringent, the stronger prevails. This section shows the elements of GM risk mitigations of the special safety conditions and of the medium risk safety requirements, which are both contractual requirements that are above OSHA regulations. So we're going to review verbiage in green. So anywhere that you see green is where I'm going to emphasize to you that these are requirements that are above OSHA regulations. So keep in mind, GM Special Safety Conditions, the entire document for 2019 is 74 pages. I would say 55 pages of those are probably risk mitigations. But out of those 55 pages, let's take a look at the slides or the line items that are truly above OSHA regulations. Because a lot of times what happens is you as the contract manager may get pushback from the seller based on requirements that you're telling them that they have to abide by. But the thing I want to show you guys is that, hey, most of these are regulatory requirements anyway, so they should be abiding by them anyway. So certain things that GM is asking that's above and beyond regulations, but a lot of it is absolutely OSHA regulations anyway. So let's take a look at those. Keep in mind, there are approximately 26, so we're focusing on the risk mitigation requirements and construction risk mitigation requirements. So between Section 4 and Section 5, there are about 24 different risk mitigations. So we're going to take a look at seller's risk mitigation requirements that are above OSHA regulations. So in 4.1 aerial lift, the requirements for aerial lift, if you look at the special safety conditions, are about 2 pages. Out of those 2 pages, these are the 2 line items that are above OSHA regulations. We have a requirement for a 3-foot rule, and we have a requirement for weight for the wave. In addition, we have a requirement where we're defining fixed length lanyards for aerial lift baskets. Those are the only 2 items that are above regulations in terms of aerial lifts. We also have a risk mitigation called barricading. In the barricading section, I believe the entire document is about 1 page. Out of that 1 page, we have 3 different line items that are above OSHA regulations. Those 3 are barricades erected out of snow fence, are required to be supported by rope or wire at the top to prevent sagging. We also have defined fixed lift lanyards for aerial lift baskets. And we have signage requirements at 20-foot intervals on each side. Electrical cable pulling. So this entire section is actually above OSHA regulations. So when you look at section 4.5, which focuses on electrical cable pulling, this entire section is above OSHA regulations. So I didn't copy the whole thing in here. I just wanted to make sure that you guys knew that this entire section is above. And just note that this section applies for cable pulls that require the use of powered mechanical pulling devices such as external rigging to assist in the pulling of cables exceeding 1,000 feet of cable and 1 continuous length, or mechanically assisted cable pulls exceeding 180 degrees in turn. So take a look at section 4.5 because if you have electrical cable pulling, then that entire requirement is above OSHA regulations. Apprentices in training, this entire requirement is also above OSHA regulations, but it truly is only these 2 bullets. So this is not a long requirement. It's not a long requirement, but it is above OSHA regulations. So our new one here is employees in training / apprentices. So we now require that employees in trainings and apprentices are identified by either a hard hat with a red stripe or a red safety vest or other methods agreed to by GM. All employees in training and apprentices must work with an experienced employee, such as an apprentice with a skilled journeyman, unless the work is low risk. 4.9 Energy control. So essentially, the industry allows tag out, GM requires lockout. So GM requires a physical lock be placed on hazardous energy to control it. We do not allow the use of a tag. 4.10, industrial hygiene programs. We do have two statements in there that are above OSHA regulations. We require the sellers to review their silica control plans with GM, and that GM has the right to require the seller to implement additional controls. In addition, we also have a secondary one, which is looking at hexavalent chromium. We now require that welding rods be approved by the site's chemical control committee prior to being used. Our goal is to make sure that the welding rods contain 10% or less of chromium. And they would have to have, they meaning the seller would need to have justification to use a welding rod with more than 10% chromium. 4.11 material laydown. The requirement for a safety factor of 1.5 between beams. For example, if a beam is 3 foot tall, there must be 4.5 feet between beams in order to prevent crushing. In addition, we have over-the-road truck drivers delivering material to laydown yards are not permitted to remove straps used to secure the load until after a qualified rigger has made an assessment that the load has not shifted. Section 4.16, roof access. The requirement that's above OSHA regulations is that that the seller must have a roof access control process, right? Which means that basically the seller cannot simply access GM's roof whenever they would like. We also have a requirement 5.4, which is a U.S. construction only requirement. And this requirement, once again, is above OSHA regulations. So when you look at drug and alcohol screening, we have about 5 or 6 different requirements for construction in the U.S. One of those is before being admitted to the job site, all sellers and subcontractors employees must have direct active involvement on the job site construction activity, must provide evidence of a negative 10-panel drug screen. Employer administered and union-based drug and screening programs are acceptable as long as they meet the following criteria, which is a 10-panel drug screen minimum, random drug testing, annual drug testing once every 12 months, and for-cause testing. Chain of custody form is not considered a proof of negative drug screen. Continuing on, we're saying instant testing can be used as long as a letter of attestation is provided, and the instant test is then sent to the lab for confirmation. If an instant test lab results come back positive, the worker is to be immediately removed from the project. Drug and alcohol screen is good for all GM sites. GM is not entitled to review the actual results. We can audit chain of custody forms to attest that the process has been followed. When you look at section 5.8, which focuses on steel erection, the requirement for fall protection to begin at 6 feet, is a requirement that's above OSHA regulations. Section 4.14, which is powered industrial vehicles. The way we meaning GM, defined powered industrial vehicles is slightly different than how OSHA defines it. So OSHA does not include earth-moving and heavy-duty construction equipment as powered industrial vehicles. However, our GM risk mitigation standard does. In addition, we require that all powered industrial vehicles used to transport materials, including the transportation of waste materials, to be secure wheels to prevent movement while parked on inclines greater than 1%. And we require equipment without backing alarms to sound a horn before moving in reverse. So keep in mind, these are all vehicles that are defined as powered industrial vehicles, as noted in our risk mitigation section. 4.16, roof access. So the items that are above OSHA regulations is the requirement for a safety FEMA or risk assessment prior to beginning work. And then we allow low-risk work on roof to be conducted by one person as long as frequent contact is made. And we have defined frequent contact as a minimum of every 30 minutes. 4.18, welding and hot work. We have a requirement that applies to hot work and defines minimum requirements for operating, inspecting, and testing portable oxy-fuel equipment. We include requirements for fire protection and spark containment for electric welding operations. We have in there that the requirement must be followed when working inside or outside of our building that is on the buyer's premises. We prohibit welding, cutting, and heating up metal drums, barrels, or tank unless pre-approved by GM. And just a note here, we also have the welding rod requirement in this section as well, where your welding rods must be pre-approved by the Site Chemical Control Committee, and there needs to be approved just cause to use a welding rod with more than 10% chromium. So some key takeaways here. Assist in review, process, and sign off of workers' pretest plan work instructions. Once again, GM is reviewing and accepting the pretest plans, not approving. We are identifying shortcomings and problems, not methods. We are validating the key elements of the safety contract management are being followed by the seller, such as the JSA, such as the planning questions, safety FEMA, worker safety engagement, etc. We are validating that contract workers understand the expectations of them from the safety contract management program. Remember that the work instruction pretest plan forms are all owned by the seller. GM should not be retaining copies of these records. And we also need to expect and encourage workers to be engaged in hazard recognition. All right, once again, we want to return people home safely, every person, every site, every day. I hope you found value in this guidance training. Once again, you have any questions about it or you have any questions at all about safety contract management, please reach out to anyone on the safety contract management team. Thank you again for joining. Have a great day.